Good morning, everyone. I'm Father John Hynes here at St. Catherine of Siena Parish in Wilmington, Delaware. Great to be with you. The scriptures today tell us of three calls by God to persons. And to take the first one, Isaiah the prophet, Isaiah was already a prophet, meaning a kind of religious counselor to the king. But the call that came to him today was deeper. It was a direct call from God to speak for God, not to the king about the king's affairs. The importance of Isaiah was that Israel had to face the facts that they were not going to be the kingdom of David, that would subdue the whole world for God. That God's call to David and it was something different. In fact, the dynasty of David would die out in the next 200 years. So Isaiah is the name we give to that first prophet, but also to 3 or 4 other prophets who spoke in God's name during that 200-year period. The period when the king of Israel ceased to exist as king, and the line of David seemed to die out. What God was prophesying through Isaiah could be summed up in that phrase we hear during Advent before Christmas: the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name God with us. They didn't realize, but this was a prophecy of Jesus. The second call is St. Paul, Saul. And in a later part of his life, he's saying, I don't deserve to be an apostle. I persecuted the church. Saul had been a fanatic for the Jewish religion, which he considered to be God's will for the whole world. And he wanted the Jewish religion to be perfect. And so he was persecuting the Christians, who he considered to be a subversive, heretical group. And that's when his call came. And like Isaiah's call, Paul's call was not like a 90-degree turn or a 180-degree turn in his life. It was almost more like a course correction. What he had been seeking for so long as a rabbi and a student of the scripture in Judaism, he now found came to its fulfillment with Christ. And so Paul did not change and go in a different direction. He clarified his own direction, just like the prophet Isaiah clarified the direction of Israel. And he himself, as prophet, left his profession where he made his money and became a spokesman for God. Thirdly, we have Peter, called by Jesus after the miraculous catch of fish. We can see that Peter was already, Simon as he was already a successful businessman, a successful entrepreneur. He had partners in fishing. And his call was not to cease fishing, but to now fish for people. So in each case, there was a kind of course correction, bringing each of them to his true calling, what God had created him for. I say these things because each of us has a calling from God. And like the 3 persons mentioned, sometimes that calling isn't fully evident at the beginning. God's call to us, it might be remembered the way Peter or Paul or Isaiah is remembered, one incident at a certain moment in their life, in 5 minutes or 1 hour or 3 days, which changed the direction of their life. Actually, these stories in the Bible sum up years and decades of people's lives, because once the initial call takes hold, more things happen, things we never foresaw. I was talking recently at a luncheon with a man whose career is working with autistic children. And it was striking how, first of all, how excited and eager he was to share. He barely got to touch his lunch. His work with the children, the fascination and the fulfillment he finds in seeing children reach some of their hidden potential. And what also struck me was how he had come to his calling. He began as a teacher, majored in psychology, and then along the way, with dealing with autistic kids from time to time, he realized that he had an aptitude, a skill with them, and now it's his whole career. This applies to us. God calls us where we are, not to become something totally different, but to carry through on who we are to a far fuller extent than we could have ever done without him. As St. Paul says, by the grace of God, I am what I am, even though I was the last born of the disciples and the least and don't deserve it. And actually, I have labored harder than any of them. And yet, it wasn't me, it was God's grace working in me. Somehow we're meant to become the person we were destined to be by a push, a help from God which enlarges our vision, which deepens our awareness, and which carries us through to become the person God created us to be. Not by our own efforts, but by our efforts cooperating with God's grace. So whether you are married with children, married, single, with a profession or work or family concerns, is not the measure of who you are. It's the way you recognize your vocational call within the circumstances of your life. And it may be described in the Bible on one occasion, but it colors our whole life. So God bless you, and may God's call continue to work within your heart as it did for the three of them. I wish you a blessed week.